2, 1. We're live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Holo/Holochain Ask Me Anything. This is AMA number 32, and I am going to be here today with our Executive Director, Mary Camacho, as well as Arthur Brock. I am Matthew Schutte. Arthur is our co-founder of Holochain. We're going to start off, as always, with some quick thank yous. Once again, we want to thank our collaborators, contributors, supporters, community builders, partners, and HApp creators who all share the vision of a more distributed internet. Special thanks to those who are writing, reviewing, and/or creating developer and community resources to increase engagement and awareness. We encourage you to visit holo.host and to follow us on Twitter to learn more about what we do. And go ahead and check out our new, relatively new still, forum at forum.holochain.org, where the resources are available to help you build your first Holochain app. Some quick announcements. There are several upcoming meetups and events planned this month. On November 15th, we have a meetup in Brussels, in Belgium. On the 15th through the 17th, we have a hAppathon, a Holochain hAppathon, where people are going to be building applications in Barcelona. On the 18th, there will be a virtual get-together. On the 19th through the 21st, there's going to be the Sharing Cities Conference that some of us are going to be participating in Barcelona. And then on December 6th through 8th, the Holochain hAppathon will be happening in New York City. You can stay up to date on our events at holo.host/events. And with that, Mary, do you want to make some remarks before we dive into the questions?
Sure, I'll do that. Hi, everybody. It's Mary Camacho, Executive Director of Holo. So as most of you have likely heard already, we announced publicly that we'll be shipping HoloPorts by the end of the year this year. So yay. There's nobody else making any noise on that one. But anyway, there's a few things I want to thank you. Making it a little bit more natural. There's just a couple of things I want to say about that. So shipping HoloPorts is super exciting step in this journey that we're taking to get to a live Holo hosting network. This really means that for the first time, we'll be testing out Holochain apps at scale with regular web users able to interact with other users of P2P apps, peer-to-peer applications. We've made a ton of progress in our development and in recent weeks to bring this all together. And we put out a leadership org update not too long ago, I think last week, in the Holo Medium channel, and they'll put that link here in the notes. But you can read that to get a lot of the details about that progress. A few of the things that we didn't say there is that part of what has given us the ability right now to predict and announce that we're shipping HoloPorts in December is that much of the work we talked about earlier in the year has borne fruit, has come to fruition, so to speak. We've worked through a lot of the technical blockers that we were encountering during our shift to using Rust with Holochain. And our dev teams have also become more and more predictable in the work as they move through each sprint. So this is really exciting because it means that not only are we announcing and letting everybody know that HoloPorts are coming, but as we move into the new year, it's going to allow us to give progress more regularly and release more regularly. So a couple of other notes about what shipping HoloPorts means. So this is an alpha test. This is not beta. That means it's not live. HoloFuel is going to be a test fuel during alpha. We're setting up all the processes for testing feedback during this process. And whether or not you're a host or some other type of user, you'll be hearing more about how you can engage with us and provide that feedback that will allow us to make the hosting network even better. The Holo network is not done when we ship HoloPorts. If you read through the requirements in that leadership org update that I just was referencing, there's 5 major requirements that we're meeting for getting to this stage in the alpha test. And there are many, many other features that we're going to be adding that are going to be required for Holo to get to live beta. And so we'll be talking more and more about that in the coming year, but we're super excited now and we're ready to get this show on the road. So I think we can move on to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. All right. So first question. This is a longer one, and it seems like it's got a few questions in it. So I'll just dive in. I just discovered that Amazon AWS has an entire serverless computing enterprise based on a serverless platform, which provides things like computing power, storage, API proxies, etc. This is according to the AWS website. How does Holo compare to AWS's serverless service? And why might someone choose one over the other? How are the services different both technically and pragmatically in practice? And then they wrote in parentheses, P.S. After thinking on it, I can surely see how Holo and Holochain could and will likely be much faster and cheaper than AWS, which alone is pretty damn great. But I'd still like to hear a comparison from a member of the team. Also, from a UX perspective, could a Holo app and an AWS app be practically indistinguishable? In other words, any app you might create on AWS could be configured to run on Holo, just faster and cheaper. I know that's a few separate questions, but I'd appreciate responses to any of them. Thanks. All right, I'm throwing this to Arthur. Arthur, what are your thoughts?
Well, you could say that the whole marketing of offerings as serverless, it doesn't mean peer-to-peer. It just means it's still on Amazon's servers. You just don't have to get your own server, your own sort of virtual server. What you do is instead you assemble a bunch of their services that are configured to work together. So you assemble database and Lambda functions and file storage and all that kind of stuff. All those assets are still centralized and sitting on Amazon's servers. But you don't have to run your own virtual server instance and maintain that where you install your own database and web server and those types of things. You're basically calling into their services. So you could say that calling it serverless is just clever marketing, or they're being very narrow in how they're defining server, because it is still running on Amazon servers for sure. But that's totally different than the P2P nature of Holochain or the peer hosting of Holo, which is actually spread across the whole network, and there is no one central place where all the data is stored.
Yeah, I really like that. From my perspective, the AWS stuff is it's serverless from the perspective of an engineer, an operations guy who was always having to maintain and set up these servers. It's sort of I tick this box, tick this box, tick that box. So they abstracted away some of the management side for one particular person. But on the back end, it's still very much a server-centric offering. All right, next up. At what stage in the roadmap can we expect the token swap? Will this be near the HoloPort shipment date? Mary, can I get you to comment on this?
Sure thing. So HOT's not going to be in a swap period, meaning that we will have announced the beginning of a 6-month period that HOT can be swapped for HoloFuel with 1-to-1 until, at a minimum, Holo is live in beta mode. So that is not what we're doing, as I was talking about earlier. We're going into an alpha mode with the shipment of HoloPorts. So really what this means is that HoloFuel will be you can transact with HoloFuel, but it's a test HoloFuel. It's not real HoloFuel. And so when we ship the HoloPorts, we're going to be in this alpha test period until all of the rest of the core functionality is ready.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. All right, next up. They say, what do you think the roadmap for porting Holochain to mobile platforms will look like? Arthur, can you try that one on?
Yeah, we're looking at different phases of this rolling out. So that for us, the very first priority has to be getting web hosted services functioning, because that's what we promised in Holo, and that's what people are hosting on Holo. So the very first phase of being able to access Holochain apps on your mobile phone is having them Holo hosted, is being able to basically use a browser just like you would use any web browser, and you're basically using an HTML app, but you can do that via the mobile phone. But it's not running locally on the mobile phone. It's actually still hosted. Phase 2 is connected to our WASM conductor, our WebAssembly conductor. So an engine that runs Holochain apps in a WebAssembly context. In this case, it can be run in a web browser or another WebAssembly interpreter. Another way of thinking of this is as kind of a light client. Something to understand about Holochain is because Holochain is completely peer-to-peer, every node is basically running both a client and a server aspect. So they have the application intelligence in the client as well as the network intelligence of the server synchronizing with other nodes in the DHT. What you would get in this phase 2 is the client side of this, where you're running Holochain and you're able to have the code locally, validate things locally, have your source chain locally, that kind of thing. But you're not doing the network services because that web servers, first of all, or web browsers don't deal with inbound networking requests well. In fact, and frankly, mobile phones don't deal with inbound networking requests well because the phones are designed to sleep apps that are not being used actively by you at this moment, which means that the network can't continue to talk to that app and synchronize the data. So at this phase, you still would need a DHT backend that is kind of your presence on the network that is having data synchronized and that kind of stuff, even when your phone is offline or the app is asleep. And then the web client functions as sort of your counterpart. Those two functions are a little bit split, but they're still designed to work together. And finally, phase 3 is being able to actually pull the network client all the way into a full mobile app. But because of the issues of apps sleeping on phones and that kind of stuff, we actually have to integrate with Apple's and Android's, proprietary messaging infrastructure to wake the app up when messages come in and that kind of stuff. And that just hasn't been the focus of our development yet. So we're getting to that in the final phase that activates all that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arthur. I'm going to be sending this next question back to you. So you're coming right back up. So don't go too far. This one is, how will Holochain prevent double spending attacks? For those who aren't familiar, double spending is one of the things that Bitcoin was kind of designed to prevent. So how will Holochain prevent double spending attacks? If I make a transaction to someone in node A and node A goes offline, how does node B know the amount of Holo I have if I want to make a transaction to someone in node B? It's an interesting way to structure that sentence. But Arthur, how do we handle double spending attacks?
Yeah, the node A and node B stuff, I think, may be a little off base. So let me clarify the question. Holochain is completely peer-to-peer. So you don't interact with like some miner or node. There's not a class of miners or stakers that you are interacting with. Everybody actually who is a user of Holochain is running their own instance of the application, and then they write locally to their own source chain where you author things. And then those things get published to the shared space, a DHT, which is also a peer-to-peer structure. So you're holding parts of the DHT and everybody is holding parts of the DHT. And it's easy to shard DHTs, so nobody has to hold the whole thing. So first of all, that's just a little overview of how Holochain works. And the reason we get this question so frequently about double spending attacks is that one of the things that we say is that Holochain is agent-centric in that every user is a complete agent on the network and embodies their full state locally rather than being data-centric or token-centric, cryptographic token-centric like blockchain is. So the technology behind Bitcoin is blockchain, and what you're really doing in blockchain is you are managing a global state across all nodes. And there's a consensus algorithm to basically choose whose next set of commits gets to be the master for this time block. And then that's randomized around to different people. And everybody has to validate all of those state changes. But everybody has to know where every token is, right? So imagine if you and I want to do a little cash transaction and I hand you $20, but in order for you to accept that $20, you have to know where every dollar in the universe is, right? Like, this is essentially the way blockchain has framed the problem by being a data-centric architecture. We have to know the state of all of the data universally, and we have to have universal agreement, consensus on it, right? Holochain isn't framing the problem that way. Holochain is basically saying, again, we've built Holochain off of the patterns that we see in nature and biology and physics, right? So in the physical world, change happens locally, and then information about that change propagates chaotically and unevenly, actually. So basically, Holochain is replicating this, and yet still creating a way in the DHT, which gives you a globally addressable database of a sort, a distributed database to look up anything. It lets you do local state changes and have global visibility into them. And so now let's get to answering the question, how do you prevent a double spend? In Holochain, a double spend would be like, I make a backup of my chain, and I then spend 1 million credits to Matthew, and I immediately restore from backup and try to spend those same 1 million credits to Mary, right? Well, the thing is that Matthew, when his process of countersigning this and signing to his chain, is going to publish it to the DHT. Even if I hack my node to prevent my side of the transaction from publishing, in order for us to do the transaction, I had to give him my header signature so he can publish it to the DHT on both of our behalfs. So that data got pushed to the global database already. That transaction is already visible in the global database. Now, not every node needs to have that transaction for every node to be able to look up that transaction. The whole point of a DHT is it's a globally addressable space. All you have to be able to do is look it up. So we can look up the links on, if you have header publishing turned on, you can look up the links on me to see what headers I've published, right? And so when I go to try to do the transaction with Mary, what we've suggested—
I'm going to say no.
Well, you're going to look up for, you're going to look for a transaction that actually points to, and actually the nodes that store this on the database as part of the validation rules have the ability to detect fork chains or rollbacks. Basically, the headers in my local hash chain, for me to do this rollback and move forward again, or that kind of thing, it means I'm going to create another transaction that has a header that points back to the same previous transaction. And that's really easy to detect. When you have two headers that point back to the same thing, you can just see that I've rolled back or tried to cheat or fork my chain or whatever. And so the game in this scenario is being able to detect it. And the place where things get a little bit tricky is if you are offline. So one of the weird things about Holochain is that it enables the possibility of offline or asynchronous transactions. And so you have to make sure that your validation model for the currencies you set up, Holochain doesn't have a built-in currency. You have to build currencies on top of Holochain. And for HoloFuel, we have basically set up HoloFuel to not operate offline. It's a hosting currency. Hosts are supposed to be online. So HoloFuel is not designed to operate offline. And so we can detect whether you are actually online or not. And if we're online, that means we're looking at the same DHT, and we can get this information. And I've already talked longer than I need to about this, I think. But basically, the gist is you don't have to have global consensus to be able to look up the headers on my chain. Oh, and the very first question is in here also was, how do you know how much the balance is? Well, that's recorded in my chain history. You can basically fast forward through my history, doing the pluses and minuses and all that kind of stuff to be able to see what my current balance is.
Awesome. Thank you, Arthur. All right, next question. Will the Holo hosting framework accept any other money besides that converted from ERC20 hot tokens? Mary, can you take this on?
Oh, sure. So inside the Holo hosting network, you will only transact in HoloFuel. I mean, what that means is that anyone purchasing hosting will need to pay hosts with HoloFuel. so initially when we go into our live beta period, you're going to be buying, you'll be able to buy HoloFuel using HOT, and that will be at the HOT reserve. But we expect to open up lots of other reserves in different national currencies, and some of those, and we also expect some exchanges will support HoloFuel. So you can purchase HoloFuel, or you will be able to purchase HoloFuel in many different currencies potentially, and we don't even know which pairs some of the exchanges might offer. Does that?
Yeah, I think that gets us there. In other words, early on, HOT for HoloFuel. That's the way into HoloFuel is HOT initially, but we are anticipating doing additional currencies, and others are going to facilitate other kinds of swaps as well. And we don't have perfect visibility on the future of what all that's going to be. All right, because we don't control them. They're doing their own stuff. That's people deciding what they want to facilitate other people trading. Next question. When will users be able to download software that allows their spare computing power on their personal phones and computers to be distributed to host third-party apps? I know HoloPorts are top priority, but this seems like a critical step for massive global adoption. So for those who aren't familiar here, I'm going to de-jargonify this a touch. HoloPorts are the little mini computers that we're selling that are sort of a plug-and-play hosting computer. And at the same time, we are anticipating enabling people to use the same kind of software to do that sort of hosting on their ordinary computer. So this is a question about when do we get that software for the non-HoloPorts to use on other computers? Mary, can you get there? Oh, I'll take it. I'll go in. So in other words, this technology is being developed now. We're already working on that. It's built obviously on the same framework as what we're using on the HoloPorts. But from a support perspective, we're prioritizing HoloPorts. We had people who stood up with us, alongside us, that supported us, that helped us get off the ground. They're getting the first crack at this. However, we will have support for other computers. This is what we're aiming for. That should become available prior to the beta launch of Holo. Right? So we're moving into an alpha phase now. Later, when we go into our beta phase, there should be support for other computers, not just HoloPorts. Arthur, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just one other point of clarification. We have built something we call HoloPort OS, which you will be able to download and install on non-HoloPort devices. But those would still need to be dedicated devices, or you could run it in a virtual machine on top of a computer, or you could run them on cloud-hosted instances. But basically, you can run instances of HoloPort OS, and it is essentially optimized already to do all of this, right? It's plug and play and ready to go in that regard. We are not investing energy right away in you time sharing your laptop or phone for performing hosting. And the reason for that is laptops are, closed, 75% of the time or something. They're offline, at least 50% of the time, something along the. What we're trying to do is build a hosting network of devices that are online all the time. They're actually dedicated to this. And you certainly could also, all the other Holo hosting software is open source. You could install that and try to do that splitting yourself. But at the moment, if you want the easy prepackaged thing ready to go and run hosting, it's basically set up to run on its own device.
And just to de-jargonify a little bit, for time sharing or splitting, that means, hey, I'm doing email or watching a YouTube video and also hosting at the same time, right? So I'm using my laptop for my own personal use, and the spare capacity is getting used to host. That's the thing that we're not prioritizing in this early phase. But we do anticipate that coming along, whether it's through us or somebody else in the open source community, as Arthur just proposed. All right, next up. Do you consider WASM or WASI to be a complete replacement for pluggable protocols for protocols? If so, what other parts of Scepter would you like to develop once Holochain is running smoothly? Also, what's your experience using WASM in production been like? What interesting things have you learned from it? How easy will it be to use other languages with WASM toolsets going forward? Still a dedicated Rustation. So this is somebody who uses Rust. And WASM, I'll let you like both let people know what is WASM and then answer both those questions.
So WASM is WebAssembly. ASM is the abbreviation for assembly language, and so WASM is, and it's designed to run in web browsers, but there's also a lot of other interpreters or engines being created for running WASM. So WASM very possibly may be becoming kind of the new portable code that in many ways Java sort of held this for a long time, because with the Java virtual machine, you could run in different things. WASM is kind of an approach to this that's actually sandboxed and safe in your browser and different things like that. So let me first say WASM has nothing to do with Scepter's pluggable protocols for protocols. And for those of you that don't know what Scepter is, that's ceptr.org if you want to look that up. That's kind of the parent project behind Holochain that goes a lot deeper into rebuilding all of our tech. And one of the things that it has is self-describing protocols, where for communications, for computing, for all kinds of different things. And WASM doesn't really enable that for a bunch of different reasons. So this is a different thing. What we're really using it for is fast portable code that can provide deterministic validation so that everybody gets the same result when they run it, because that's kind of important on the whole peer-to-peer validation part. And frankly, using WASM has proven challenging in the context we're using it, because it creates a little bit of a black box that is hard to troubleshoot and debug. Like we're kind of on such the bleeding edge of technology here in using WASM that the tool set isn't as mature for providing a lot of debuggers and things like that. So when you write a Holochain app and it compiles to WebAssembly and runs, and you get an error, well, it doesn't give you a code trace back to where in your app, which line in your app the thing was from. And so it makes it much harder to debug. And we've spent a lot of time doing kind of that old brute force, like putting print statements in, trying to figure out where is this breaking and why. And so that feels like a little bit of backward progress in toolset, but we also know that it's just an immature environment, and more kind of tools are coming out regularly to help with this sort of troubleshooting. And I think it was a little bit of a bleeding edge decision to make this choice, but I think it really has proven that things are moving in this direction. It turns out things it was probably a good choice. We were skating to where we thought the puck was going to be, and so I think that's actually working out well.
Way to go, Gretzky.
Michigan roots are showing, Arthur.
Yeah. That's not Southern California kind of references there. All right. What is your best guess as to when the Rust recoding will be completed? And what is your best guess as to when the HoloPorts will ship? I think this
I got this one
before. Yeah. Go ahead, Mary.
This is the night for all the tech questions, but I think I can handle this one. We said when we're shipping HoloPorts, we just announced at the end of this year. Again, I want to keep saying it. We're shipping HoloPorts in 2019. I think I said that on a video once. Actually, there was another article that got published in the last couple of weeks that maybe it was last week again, that Nico wrote, and it was about our Sim2H networking in Holochain. And I loved actually one of the statements that he had in there. So I'm just going to quote him to answer this question. Sim2H marks the first point in time since we abandoned the Go prototype at which anyone, developers and non-developers, can run alpha test releases of Holochain applications over the public internet. So I think that although this doesn't exactly answer the question about when the recoding will be complete, I think it says something super important, which is that we're at the stage that you can write apps and test them with Holochain today. There certainly are some functions that we're still building that may have been in the Go prototype that are not in the Rust version right now, but there's other things that we've built in the Rust version that may not have been in the Go prototype. So at this point, we're moving forward in a sort of way that provides the features that we need to be building on Holo. are to be building Holo.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. All right, next question. This is a little more technical. Can you explain the distinction between Sim2H and Triorama? You gotta love our names, right? Sim2H and Triorama. Is Sim2H for public testing while Triorama is for network simulation in one memory space? Please clarify this. Arthur, bring the tech knowledge.
So yeah, you're kind of barking up the right tree there. Sim2H is our simulated network infrastructure that is still centralized. It's not completely peer-to-peer, but it basically, do you remember the days of the old operator switchboards where you'd plug in the wire, no, nobody remembers those days really, unless but anyway, the gist is it's kind of like that. Sim2H is connecting wires between different peers because peer-to-peer networking is hard for lots of reasons, for firewalls and NATs and that kind of stuff. And so this allows the nodes in an application to talk to a switchboard to connect to each other, essentially. Triorama is a testing. It's a framework. It's a simulation framework. So in other words, you write tests and then it generates all kinds of fake nodes to run those tests. But real nodes could actually be using the switchboard. You can also use Sim2H to do testing and do simulation and testing on that. But Sim2H lets you actually run applications at the moment with an easy way through the NATs and firewalls while we are finishing those parts of our P2P networking architecture.
Awesome. Thank you, Arthur. All right, next step. Do HAP, and again, that's Holochain application users, do HAP users have to have a HoloPort or a local install of Holochain? For example, a property owner in your fictitious Airbnb HAP. If not, where does all their data get stored? Mary?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So first of all, Holochain app users don't need a HoloPort. That's the whole point of the Holo network. We know that not everyone is quite ready to move into the distributed world. There's barriers in any early version of technologies that they tend to make it easier for some people to adopt things than others. Just look how crypto adoption has gone, or actually is still going. There are really very few people who know how to use crypto. It doesn't seem like that to you and I, or probably all the people listening to this video. But the reality is it's a very small subset of mainstream that is using crypto right now. And I don't know if you guys recall, but like the You've Got Mail from AOL back in what I consider the middle days of the internet, that was the stage of the internet when everybody got on, when it became mainstream. So that's going to take a while. So back to Holo and Holochain applications. When a Holochain application is hosted on Holo, it allows the regular browser user, somebody who's just on the internet and using, whether it be Chrome or Firefox or whatever, go to an app, and it allows them to use the same Holochain app that you and I might be using directly. So when they log into the app, they're going to be creating the same security data that we would on our Holochain installation. But it's done inside of a secured iframe. And this is essentially, and I'm going to say it really basically, the same sort of secure technology that companies like Stripe or a bank would use on the web to keep your login secure, except then it gets hosted out on HoloPorts. So that's the less technical version. Arthur, if you want to explain what's really happening under the hood, you can take that at a technical level if you want.
I just really briefly would say Holochain is designed to be peer-to-peer, has nothing to do with HoloPorts or Holo hosting in that regard. Holo hosting bridges those Holochain apps to web users, right? So you with a web browser, if you're not running a Holochain locally, somebody else can provide that hosting for you. And so the idea is this allows us to reach mainstream in a way that, like blockchain and stuff, have had problems going mainstream, and that's on purpose. We're trying to do that. We're trying to make it possible to do all the things you're used to doing on the internet, do the the Facebook, LinkedIn type of activities, be able to build those kinds of things on Holochain. And if you want to host yourself, you can run a Holochain node. And if you don't, then it'll be Holo hosted.
Awesome. Thank you, both of you. And I'm grateful, Mary, for bringing the Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan memories of love blooming over email pings, notifications. It sounds so much less romantic now that we're all buried in a flood of email, right?
Yeah, they weren't getting 2,000 a day.
No. Little did they know. All right. How do you foresee the next 2 years playing out for Holochain versus blockchain? To me, it seems like Holochain warrants being a developer's go-to distributed app framework to build on, as long as global consensus is not necessary. And even if it were necessary, Holochain can support blockchains while blockchain cannot support Holochains. Looking forward to your insight on this topic. Arthur, you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, let me first say I'm completely biased, right? Like, but I do think that once people truly understand, like they see it in action, how much faster, easier, and I think we're going to be able to, in time, demonstrate being more secure even than blockchain. That it's going to be hard for blockchain-based systems to compete. Like it's going to be hard to point to a higher value proposition on that side. It's just like higher cost to run and more overhead, resource use, that kind of thing. But that being said, blockchain's gotten a huge head start. Blockchain has gotten, especially entrenched, I think, in the token space, right? A lot of people are kind of true believers in Bitcoin and Ethereum and those kinds of things. And so I'm not suggesting that we can immediately displace all of that, but over time, it may become difficult to justify, running using 1/200th of the planet's energy to do 5 transactions a second on Bitcoin when you can do other things that don't require a lot of energy use and still have them actually be more decentralized than because they're completely distributed, completely peer-to-peer, and still accomplish the same things. But it's going to take a while for people to believe that and trust that, and they're going to have that experience. And I think Holo is one of being our first big commercial project built on top of Holochain, is one of those proving grounds. I think if we can have people pull up Slack-like chats or Wikipedia-type things, and they can be interacting with these things and have real-time experience from something that's completely peer-to-peer, and they can see that it stays resilient to attack and that kind of thing, that people are going to start to understand the impact of what we're rolling out.
Yeah, and I'll just riff on that a little bit. I agree that there's a lot of folks who see tokens in a particular way and they think about them in a certain way. We are doing some currency design courses through Commons Engine. So if those of you are out there who are interested in designing new forms of currency that can foster different kinds of flows of activity, maybe go check that out. But I think there's a whole bunch of areas where people were really excited about blockchain having the possibility to create new patterns of coordination that it just simply hasn't delivered on yet. And I think a lot of those areas we're going to start to see real traction when people pick up Holochain and start using it. And as Arthur said, once people experience it, then it becomes not just some folks making a claim, it becomes, oh yeah, this is possible. What else could we do here? All right, next up. I heard that the next phase of adoption will come from gaming, gambling, and DeFi space. What are your views on this? I'm gonna just make a little aside here before we go into the, gosh, I don't know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I was hanging out with Vitalik Buterin and some other folks at some meetup. He had come to San Francisco to talk. There were like 12 of us in the room or something. So we all went and did dinner afterwards. And somebody said, what's going to be the next, what's going to be the thing that really takes off on Ethereum? And Vitalik was like, gambling, obviously. So this is not new. This is where people think it's going to go for a long time. But where do you think it's going to go, Mary? For Holochain, not Ethereum, obviously.
Right. Well, I mean, to some degree, that is one of the places that pushes innovation, right? I mean, the gambling is on there are quite a few gambling groups that are using some blockchain technology already, because it is important that they have the sort of immutability of results and that sort of thing. But, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of different industries, a lot of different verticals are going to be looking to use Holochain, because there's just a variety of different aspects of what we're building that brings something new. If you ask me personally, I tend to have, odd pragmatic examples of what I think would be great for, including things like, medical records and things that are kind of important to me, things that I would want to use. I think I just tweeted this week, I would like to see an app like Pocket, made in Holochain, because it doesn't matter where it is. I just want that data only to be mine on my stuff. I don't want to tell everybody what my reading list is. So I don't tend to use apps like that a whole lot. And those things I'm really looking forward to using. I just think there's going to be a huge variety of different ones. One of the verticals, and maybe this was in a different question that was being asked, but one of the verticals that is looking into things right now is, aviation. And we've got a partner that just won an award down in Malta last week, that's in the aviation industry. So there are tons of different verticals and a whole lot of different types of apps that you can build on Holochain that you just can't build on blockchain.
Thank you, Mary. All right, next up. This one's going to come back to you as well, Mary. How can Holochain dev adoption be accelerated? Do you think this will happen naturally? And then they wrote, insert Mozilla partnership rumor.
let's not add rumors. Well, this goes back to what Arthur was saying just a few minutes ago. People are waiting to see this demonstrated. They're waiting to see Holochain in action. And what the Holo network does is actually demonstrate Holo at scale, Holochain at scale. So I think that's really important to kind of start with from an adoption perspective. And I think the dev adoption is gaining ground. There are people starting to build on it. This is what I was saying just a few minutes ago. The partner that just won the FinTech Startup of the Year down in Malta Blockchain Awards was Aeroband, and these guys are in aviation. We've got lots of examples of other people beginning to work on Holochain and develop on Holochain. If you go to our developer .holochain.org, you can see that we're constantly releasing updates to this this tool set, basically, of how do you learn, how do you get up to speed on how to develop on Holochain. We're still doing, as you saw in our events announcements earlier today, hackathons, as we like to call them. And I think just a few weeks ago, maybe a month and a half ago, we had an online dev training as well. So there's community training, there's online training, we do events and in-person training, and then people and partners are starting to build on it all the time. So if, anyone else want to add to that?
I'll say a couple of things. I basically run around the world and sometimes talk and sometimes facilitate and often sort of have private conversations with people who are interested in Holochain and are curious, what kinds of things might be possible. And I think similar to what Arthur said, as people start to see examples, as they start to try applications, that's when we'll see a whole shift. And the thing that I always point back to, you've probably heard this before if you've watched one of these AMAs, is folks like me and Arthur and maybe Mary as well, we're looking at some very different patterns of coordination and sort of playing with these things and lobbying for them and encouraging other people to do things like home sharing or ride sharing or stuff like that. And everybody in my world was like, you're crazy. That's never going to be a thing, until Uber came along, until Airbnb came along, right? There was an experience that people had where they went, wow, this is great. You just click this thing on the phone and a car is there quickly, or you're able to find a home and the people were nice, or I'm able to make some extra revenue, or I can, all of that stuff. Once it got experienced, not explained, experienced. People didn't just start using that service. They started imagining all kinds of different services. And I couldn't possibly count how many times I heard it's the Airbnb of blank or the Uber of blank, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, right? But just a few years previous to that, nobody was talking about that stuff at all. So there was a whole sort of cultural shift in what people imagined was possible, but only after people had that sort of experience at kind of mainstream scale. Arthur, do you want to make any comments there? Ready to go on to the next one? Nah, he's done. All right, next. Do you plan to build an assembly script dev kit? Seems there's an opportunity to attract front-end developers since Holochain abstracts away the back end, but this advantage is obscured by Rust. Art?
Yeah, so when we started doing this, assembly script wasn't ready yet. I mean, just to give an example, first of all, for what it is, assembly script is a JavaScript flavor that's designed to compile to WebAssembly. And we were trying to use a language that would compile to WebAssembly, and we chose Rust because Rust was the first language that could compile to WebAssembly. Its compiler was most mature, and there's a bunch of other things about Rust that I think makes it a strong language choice. However, speed of development was not one of those for us. Let me just give that disclaimer. But what language you write Holochain apps in isn't dependent on what language we've written the back end in. So like the previous version of Holochain was written in Go, but the languages we exposed for writing Holochain apps were Lisp and JavaScript, right? In this case, we've written in Rust and we've exposed Rust for writing your Holochain apps in. Assembly script wasn't ready, and just to give a stark example of this is a JavaScript flavor that didn't yet have the ability to parse JSON, JavaScript object notation, right? This is like a standard data storage format across all sorts of things, and yet this JavaScript flavor couldn't interact with JSON at the time we started. I think that's been added since then. But our focus at the moment, we could technically extend more HDKs, just like we did with, so HDK is the Holochain developer kit. Just like we came out with 2 languages on the last one, JavaScript and Lisp. We could start supporting other languages that compile to WASM. So C, C++, C#, assembly script, Unity. There's a bunch of things that actually compile to WASM now. But the problem is that we think at the moment that would be a little off target for us. What we want to do is actually build some RAD tools, rapid application development tools, that help people frame the problem. Like, here's your entries, the data entries, the data structures, the data types that you're building, and here's the links between those that you're creating in the graphing DHT. And here's the validation code, and sort of like help people have a constructor, sort of a scaffolding or a wizard for setting up their app, and then generate a lot of that backend code. You still will probably need to write some of the validation rules, but we're focusing right now on making that part easy. But then just want to note that 90% of development of web apps isn't on the database side. It's not focused on making the distributed database structures and rules, which you would do in Holochain. Most of that is on the UI and UX, right? So because in Holochain that's loosely coupled, you can use whatever framework you want to at that. If you want to use React, if you want to use Vue, if you want to make a Qt widget and run it on desktops, you can do that as long as it can make calls into, it can make JavaScript calls essentially to the Holochain zones, then you can use any UI that you want. And so this is definitely a big target for us, is increasing usability, because right now, I think with the Rust version, Holochain's actually gotten a little bit harder to build on for a fresh new dev than the old Go version was. And part of that is we just haven't gotten all the same tools in place, and we have some people working on that right now. And Mary, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I do. This is, people ask a lot of the technical questions about how to build on Holochain, and Arthur does a great job at answering a bunch of those. But one of the things that I've seen, and I've seen it at our hackathons and also in some of our online training, is that the hurdle that most people one of the big hurdles that people need to kind of get over that gets addressed in what Arthur was describing with the RAD tools is that you really have to think differently to design applications in Holochain. The agent centricity of Holochain makes it completely different, a different way to organize your application. And I think some of the tooling and documentation that we're starting to put up on the developer section of the website, of the holochain.org website, really start answering that and getting into that more precisely. Some of the fundamentals that were recently published start having people understand that design thinking. And actually, that's one of the biggest things that happens at a hackathon. But you get to do this at this, like you're learning those fundamentals at the same time that you're actually building something. So it grounds it really well. So don't know that that helped answer the question per se, but I think it's important information. And so that anybody that's trying to get started, definitely read some of these things, watch some of the videos, because the information about how to think is important about, to the process of getting up to speed as going out and just building. So.
And since this is going to be our last question, because we've already gone over time a little bit, I'm going to just make one other, I'm going to try to give my summary of what that shift is. And that shift is a shift from thinking you can see a system from above, right? I'm viewing this whole system and all of its activity from a 30,000 foot view, to recognizing that no, it's a deeply relativistic system, that what's happening looks different from each party's perspective. And that when you start building Holochain apps, often people for half a day or a day really struggle to make that jump. But once they do, they're like, oh, of course, this is how the world actually works. And all of a sudden, they have to take certain other things into consideration, but new possibilities start to emerge as well. So that's kind of the summary of the sort of mental shift that's required. All right, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And Mary Camacho, our executive director, thank you for joining us. Arthur Brock, our co-founder of Holochain, thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Matthew Schutte, the applied philosopher. Thank you to all of our collaborators, contributors, supporters, community builders, partners, and HApp creators. And also thank you to the team behind the scenes that worked so hard to put together these AMAs. Until next time, see y'all.